Welcome to 28storms.com. This is your tropical weather Atlantic update for June 2nd, 2011. Today, the National Hurricane Center is still monitoring two separate areas for potential development. We are still looking at 93L Invest, which is the tropical disturbance now located over the central Gulf of Mexico. And we also have a large mass of disorganized convection that is still persisting over the central and western Caribbean. Here is an overall view of both of our tropical systems of interest. This is 93L Invest, and as you recall yesterday, this was the same feature that originally originated over the east coast of the United States before emerging into the western Atlantic, and by yesterday afternoon it was traversing the Central Florida Peninsula, providing areas like Daytona, Orlando, Tampa, St. Petersburg with some much needed rainfall. Unfortunately, the rainfall didn't last quite long enough because we still have fairly dry conditions in that region. But as of today, that circulation is now well south into the central Gulf, south of New Orleans and Grand Isle. And I must say that convection has really decreased compared to yesterday. There's really not a whole lot left of this system. And the main culprit behind that has been this upper level low located over the southeast Gulf of Mexico. Not only has that caused some northeast wind shear, which, as you can see, is causing much of the convection to be displaced just to the southwest of the low-level surface circulation, which is really ill-defined at this time, but it's also caused a lot of sinking air over this region of the Gulf of Mexico, and that's really killing off any type of shower and thunderstorm convective activity, and there's really not a whole lot left of this storm. Yesterday, there was some hope that this storm would possibly persist enough to provide areas like Texas and northern Mexico with some much-needed rainfall because they also have some severe drought conditions. But as time goes on, it looks like those rain chances will not be as high as originally anticipated. If anything, the rain chances may be slightly elevated over the next day or so, but definitely not any type of drought-busting rainfall. Now, further toward the south, we still have a much more interesting system of interest, and this is not an invest area just yet, but it likely will become one over the next day or possibly later on this week into the weekend. And taking another look at the visible imagery, our actual area of surface low pressure is still located just east of the coastlines of Honduras and Nicaragua. If you look really carefully here, we still have some low-level turning, and that's once again where your main area of surface low pressure is located. However, the highest and deepest cloud tops are still located well northeast of the center, and that's due to this large amount of southwest wind shear that's prevailing over much of the Caribbean and Greater Antilles, and that's a result of this strong tropical upper tropospheric trough that's being enhanced by the upper level low, once again that is still located over the southeast Gulf of Mexico. As long as this trough remains in place, the system will continue to struggle to remain organized or become better organized, as once again the low pressure is off to the south, and this is being sheared off to the northeast fairly quickly. I will say, however, that if this pattern were to persist, even if we don't get true tropical development, this is going to be highly problematic for areas, especially in Haiti, where thousands of people are still living in tents after the severe earthquake that occurred there. And as the rainfall and rainfall accumulation continues to increase, especially in mountainous areas, the threat of disease and mudslides will also be on the rise. So this is a dire situation beginning to evolve in this area, and hopefully things begin to taper down, but unfortunately the forecast does not look that optimistic. Here is the latest SIMS wind shear product analysis, and as we can see, we still have this very strong trough producing a lot of vertical wind shear over much of the area. Although I will say, though, that there's been a rather dramatic improvement in the upper level conditions for tropical development over the southern half of the Caribbean, where we're beginning to see a little bit more of upper level ridging beginning to take control of that particular area, and that's in response to this upper level low beginning to shift ever so gradually more toward the west, and as a result this trough will begin to pump more toward the north, allowing upper level ridging to become a more dominant feature down here. You can probably see this a little bit better on the color representation. As we can see, we now have low wind shear down to between 0 and 10 knots well south of Jamaica, but we still have a lot of strong wind shear to the north. And that tropical upper tropospheric trough that I mentioned can also be represented fairly well when you look at the latest 200 millibar vorticity product. And as you can see, it remains fairly dominant over the Bahamas and southeast Gulf of Mexico closer to that upper level low. So which particular area will be the main focal point for tropical development if it does occur? Some people may believe that it actually could be this concentrated massive convection moving off toward the northeast in the Hispaniola area, but as we've said, the main surface low is still well back to the southwest. Now, what are the chances that a secondary low begins to form closer to this convection? Well, if we look at the latest 850 millibar vorticity analysis, we will see that there is a secondary maximum of 850 millibar vorticity, but by far the primary area of vorticity is still located well to the southwest, and this is probably going to remain the case. As noted before, the further north you go, the closer you get to this shear axis, and the conditions just are not going to be favorable here anytime soon. And over time, if this upper level ridge over the southern Caribbean is going to build, it's going to do so more toward the northwest and western Caribbean. So let's take a quick look at some of the available model guidance to gather a better perspective as to what may occur over the next 6 days. This is the 12Z GFS forecast. This is the Southwest Caribbean, and we're looking at sea level pressure. So this map is going to show us if any surface low begins to intensify into a tropical cyclone. And if you look over the next 6 days, the GFS really doesn't show much change in intensity. If anything, surface pressures may continue to lower a little bit in the general region between Honduras and Jamaica, but nothing overly intense. And in the meantime, some very weak lows begin to develop as that convection continues to get pushed to the northeast along that trough. But these are probably not going to be your focal points of development, and this is more than likely overdone a bit in the model, whereas the main low pressure continues to stay confined to the western Caribbean. Now, this is your 850 millibar vorticity, and this will give you a better picture as to what's going on. This is the current time, and here's our primary circulation area, or low pressure area, and as I set this into motion, you really notice that the storm doesn't really move a whole lot. The main vorticity center remains between Honduras and Jamaica through the next 6 to 7 days, and that's really because there's really not a dominant steering pattern or steering parameter at the moment. We still have some ridging over the southeast and a trough over the western Atlantic, but apparently according to this model, neither one is really dominating enough to really steer this storm in any particular direction. You can see the problem a little bit better when you look at the mid-levels. This is 500 vorticity now, and we'll see that there's some ridging over the southeast United States, and there's a trough over southeast Canada that's about to drop down, and there's an outside chance that if this dives far enough south that it could eventually pick up our system and curve it out toward the northeast. As I set this into motion, you see the trough beginning to dip down, but apparently it's not quite strong enough to fully capture all of the disturbance here in the Caribbean, although much of it does advect out into the central Atlantic as that shear really begins to increase and we get some southwest mid-level flow. The jury is out. I mean, they could still quite easily recurve over Hispaniola, but even this model still shows, again, some lingering low pressure area over the central Caribbean for the next 6 to 7 days. Now, in terms of the GFS wind shear forecast, this is the current time, and as you can see, this is a really strong wind shear here, so it correctly denotes where the strongest wind shear is along the upper level trough, and here's the upper level low. And further toward the south, this is where we're starting to get an increase in upper level divergence where conditions are a bit more favorable. And if I set this in motion, the trough does try to lift north a little bit, allowing the upper level conditions to continue to become a little bit more favorable over the central Caribbean. But if you notice really closely, that upper level pocket of favorable conditions is a bit elongated from west to east, and it's really not wide enough for anything to really try to get its act together down there in terms of tropical development. So if the GFS were to verify, then obviously we probably won't get tropical development. Now, this is the latest 12Z Canadian forecast model solution, and I must warn you ahead of time that usually the Canadian is a bit too aggressive with tropical storms. It develops them too easily. But here's a look at the latest forecast, and as I set the sea level pressure forecast in motion, we still do not see much in the way of any tropical development, so that's much the same as the GFS forecast model. We really don't see any organized areas of surface low pressure in this 6-day forecast. If anything, you'll notice though that the low pressure area does seem to ever so slowly continue moving off toward the northwest. You can see this a little bit better on the 850 millibar vorticity. That 850 vort max ever so slowly continues to lift northwest toward the Isle of Youth by day 6. And as you can see, this is the 500 millibar vorticity forecast, and as this upper level trough begins to dive south, it's not quite strong enough far enough south for this system to be picked off and shunted off toward the northeast. Instead, it allows this ridge over the southeast to begin to re-strengthen a little bit once again, allowing the storm to continue moving northwest over the next week. Now, as to be expected, the Canadian shear pattern forecast is a little bit more favorable than the GFS, and as I set this in motion, you can see that the upper level ridging is a little bit more prominent over the western Caribbean, and it also expands in the same general direction that it has the surface low tracking as it moves off toward the Isle of Youth. So that would be a fairly favorable pattern if the Canadian were to verify. and that would probably produce some type of tropical mischief as we get closer to that time frame. But again, that's only if the Canadian were to actually verify. Last but not least, we'll take a quick look at the 12Z ECMWF run, and this is sea level pressure overlaid on top of the 500 millibar pattern forecast, and this is the current time, and obviously we have broad low pressure here. These really aren't three separate low pressure areas. The model is just trying to tell you that this is the broad area of low pressure with the same general pressure readings located in that area. As we go into day 1, day 2, day 3, we really don't see much change at all. The low pressure is still centered between Honduras and Nicaragua with hardly any change in intensity. We still have the large subtropical ridge dominating the weather over the southeast, causing record high temperatures, with the trough anchored off the the east coast of the United States closer to Bermuda. By day 4 and day 5, much the same. If anything, the low pressure does continue to move a little bit more toward the west, which is in a bit more agreement with the Canadian model than the GFS model, so that is a bit interesting. And by day 6, this is a really weak area of low pressure, though. Either way, it's continuing westward toward the Yucatan Peninsula, and that is the latest forecast solution from the ECMWF. So just to summarize, 93L Invest in the Central Gulf of Mexico is not going to develop. It's also not going to do much to solve the drought problems across northern Mexico or Texas. You might see a little extra rainfall, but not a whole lot. The tropical disturbance in the Caribbean is really not going to do much over the next several days. It's going to remain a very strong area of interest, and it could eventually become a tropical system within the next 5 to 7 days, but it would be very slow to evolve as the upper level conditions may or may not become more favorable. It looks like the Northwest Caribbean will be the focal point for any type of tropical development in the medium range, however, and we'll just take a closer look at the forecast models over the coming days, and of course the latest satellite and surface observations to see if we're starting to see any type of stronger low pressure strengthening. So that's it for now. Check back again tomorrow for another update from 28storms.com.